Before you start, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell stories that you won't forget. Real, cruel, touching to the point of trembling. Today it's about a girl who was sold into slavery by her father to a wild hermit. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. Buckle up. It's going to be a wild journey. Mabel Jane was born on the edge of the world, in a dusty village lost among the Texas plains, where the skies hang low and laws are written not in court, but in houses and barns, amid screams, belts and prayers. She was bigger than the other children from the very beginning, clumsy, soft, with eyes in which there was a vulnerable dreaminess. In a world where girls were expected to be submissive and thin, she was a stranger from the first breath. Her mother died in childbirth, leaving behind not only a child, but also a shadow that fell on Mabel's entire childhood. Grayson Jane's father was a hard man, broken by war, faith, and inner anger. He didn't drink until oblivion, but he drank just enough to keep the fire of anger burning in him. His love of the Bible had nothing to do with kindness. He knew by heart the verses about punishment, about sin, about the body as a vessel of vice. And he looked at his daughter as if she were Satan himself. He considered his daughter's fatness a disgrace. For him, she was a symbol of weakness, disobedience, and excess. He punished her for every extra bite, for every slow movement, for every breath if it seemed lazy to him. There were no mirrors in the house, there were no hugs, there was no silence, just the expectation of a blow. Love was a luxury that wasn't offered to her. The village did not save. People in places like this learn to be violent, because otherwise you're next. Mabel became the object of ridicule, whispers, and disgusted looks. Even adult women looked at her as a failure of nature, as something that their daughters needed to be warned against. She didn't fight, she didn't scream, she didn't complain. She just lowered her head and lived. Day after day. But she had one weakness: dreams. As night fell over the village and her father fell silent, finally falling asleep, Mabel lay on her rough pallet against the wall and imagined, what if she had been born in another place? In a city where no one looks askance, in a house where bread smells, where the mother kisses on the forehead, and the father calls by name, not burden. She dreamed of horses that run freely. About a book that can be read by the window. About how it feels to be beautiful and needed. These dreams were not just a consolation for her. They were survival. But even dreams couldn't save the day when everything changed. The summer fair is the main event of the year. For many, it was a celebration. For Mabel, it's an opportunity to disappear into the crowd for a moment. She was wearing her only decent dress, faded but neatly sewn. I tried to style my hair. I wiped the dust off my shoes. Naively, but hopefully. She had no intention of attracting attention. On the contrary, she hoped to simply pass unnoticed among the voices, smells, music and grilled meat. But fate is cruel to those who have already bent under the weight of shame. As she passed by the honey counter, someone, maybe on purpose, or maybe just stupidly, brushed against her. She stumbled and hit the edge of the barrel. Honey gushed onto her chest, arms, and hair. Everything froze for a second, and then there was laughter. Loud, angry, merciless. Someone shouted an insulting word. Someone threw a clod of earth. The crowd was buzzing like a beehive. Mabel stood there, unable to move. In honey, in humiliation, in horror. And then I saw my father. He was watching. And there was no sympathy or anger in his face, just emptiness. And there's shame in it. It was as if she had disgraced him in front of the whole neighborhood, as if her existence was the last straw. Late in the evening, when the bonfires were going out and the merchants were packing their wares, Grayson met with a man no one knew. His name was Mountain Man. A giant, silent as granite, with eyes that reflected no lights. He rarely appeared in the village, and every time, like an obsession. People said that he lived far away in the mountains, alone. That he has an axe, but no words. That he had left the world and would not return. Grayson offered a deal. No haggling. A girl for a barrel of whiskey and an old horse. No regrets. No worries. Only deliverance. He gave Mabel away as an unnecessary burden. Like something that prevents you from living. The mountain man did not ask about anything. He just nodded. He saw something in her, or he didn't see it at all. For him, it was not a woman, not a girl, but something that needed to be taken away. At dawn, the cart creaked under her weight as they drove out of the village. My father did not come out to say goodbye. No one came out. Only the old dog barked goodbye. Mabel didn't cry. Her tears were a thing of the past. She looked ahead towards the woods and rocks, and there was no hope in her heart. just cold and empty. But it was from this emptiness that her new life began. Night slowly descended on the village, and with it the noise of the day disappeared, giving way to a dull silence filled with anxiety and the unbearable weight of fate. The air was getting cooler, and its pungent smell of wormwood and soot mixed with the spicy dust hanging over the huts and sparse trees. Each house seemed like a small fortress, keeping its secrets and fears. But something special was happening at Grayson Jane's house, a deal that was going to change his life forever. Grayson was sitting at a roughly hewn table, on which lay only an oil lamp and a piece of yellowed paper, a contract written in uneven handwriting, which hid the fate of his daughter. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from inner anger and relief at the same time. He was clutching a pen as if he was going to rip out his heart with it, and across from him sat a mountain man, a mute giant whose presence in itself was a verdict. His massive figure seemed almost unreal in the dim light, broad shoulders, rolled-up sleeves of rough leather, a face with sharp features and a thick gray beard, as if from the mountain peak from which he came. There was a document between them, a simple piece of paper, not decorated with seals or the seals of the law, but important enough so that their destinies would be intertwined forever. The deal was inhumane, a girl for a barrel of cheap whiskey and an old horse that lacked neither strength nor health. No more and no less. In this world, the words love, pity, and forgiveness have been forgotten, replaced by pragmatism and cold calculation. Grayson couldn't meet his daughter's eyes as she was pinned to the wall in a dark corner of the room. Her body was trembling with fear and powerlessness. The dress, the only decent one, was dirty and stained with honey, a memento of the disgrace at the fair. Her face, pale and tear-stained, reflected the depth of the fear she had hidden inside herself since childhood. She had already stopped believing in salvation, in words of comfort or protection. She became just a burden that her father wanted to take off his shoulders. When the pen scratched the paper, the sound echoed through the room, like a signal for the beginning of the end. At that moment, all emotions seemed to freeze. There was no regret, no anger, only cold calculation. The mountain man stood up, his movements slow, as if every step was a rumble in his chest. He didn't say a word, didn't show any emotion, just pointed at the door, a sign for Mabel that it was time to go. Under the cover of the night, illuminated by the dim light of the full moon, the carriage creaked and swayed. Old, dilapidated, as if she herself was ready to crumble under the weight of her mission, she was waiting to take the girl away from everything that was familiar to her. Mabel sat inside without a word, without looking back, clenching her fists as if she was trying to keep herself from falling into the abyss of despair. Grayson stayed in the house, alone and crushed, pouring himself a glass of strong moonshine. His eyes stared at the wall, as if trying to find an excuse for his actions, but deep down he knew that he had got rid not of the problem, but of his conscience. He didn't even hear the wagon creak and disappear into the night. Behind the curtains, in the windows of neighboring houses, there were eyes and whispers. Rumors and gossip, like dark shadows, crept through the streets. "The girl is finished," they whispered with relief, as if the very life of the village had become easier from the loss of one soul. No one suspected that this was not the end, but the beginning of something much more complicated and incredible. Somewhere in the dark mountains, far from light and civilization, a mountain man looked at the cart with Mabel and thought differently. There was a spark in his eyes that no one in the village could understand. Because even the most hopeless deal can spark a new life, and even a soul sold without mercy can turn out to be stronger than anyone could have imagined. Mabel was silent all the way up the slopes. The tears have dried, but the fear remains. The cart slowly climbed the rocky path, higher and higher, to where the map ended and the land abandoned by God began. The trees closed in like a wall, the air became different, cold, predatory. The house was not what she had expected. Not a ruin, not a cave, a sturdy, gloomy log cabin, as if it had grown out of the rock itself. Secluded, without traces of neighbors, without hints of civilization. At the entrance there is a pile of firewood, a well that has been cleaned, and an old hunting dog that has raised its eyes and is buried in its paws again. They lived here. They didn't hide, they lived. Mabel jumped off the wagon, her legs shaking. His father's voice sounded in his head, cold and detached, as if he were giving away not his daughter, but a burden. "She's yours now. Do whatever you want. And everything. No more looking, no more saying goodbye." The mountain man, she now knew his name was Aiden Kane, didn't say a word. He just opened the door of the house and stepped aside. It was dark inside, and it smelled of spruce, ashes, and leather. She was shown where her sleeping place was, not a bed, but a rough pallet by the hearth. Then silence. The days passed. Cold matinees were replaced by a scorching afternoon, then cold again. Mabel didn't keep track of time, and it didn't matter. Her existence was reduced to a quiet routine, getting up before dawn, washing in icy water, a pinch of oatmeal for breakfast, monotonous work. No words, no laughter, no shouting, just the rhythm of breathing, the rhythm of survival. Aiden wasn't in charge. He didn't tell me what to do. But it was clear that he expected order, cleanliness, and an understanding of boundaries. Sometimes she caught his eye when he thought she wasn't looking. There was something primal about those moments. Not rude. Not passion. Rather, the tension is like that of an animal watching a stranger warily. He was wild and silent, but not dangerous. While, when he was working with a knife, sharpening an axe, or fixing traps, his movements were precise, almost graceful. She understood that he was part of this wilderness. Not an alien, not a survivor, but fused with a forest, a stone, a beast. He lived as if people had not existed for a long time, and only traces of old pain betrayed something more in him. Mabel, sitting by the hearth in the evenings, sometimes heard wolves. Hollow, guttural howls, as if the night itself was moaning. She was scared, but she knew that this house, this man, his wall of silence was her protection. And this feeling grew every day. It's not warm, but confidence. One day, on a particularly chilly evening, Aiden brought a deer carcass with him. He threw her off his shoulder like an empty rag, and from the threshold he threw a short, "If you do, you'll show how you did it." She froze. These were the first words in several days. And there was no contempt or threat in them. Just a test. And this assignment became the first bridge between them. She was cutting meat, her hands were shaking, and blood was dripping onto the floor. But he didn't interfere. I just stood there, watching, and for the first time, I nodded. Restrained. Almost appreciatively. And then he left in silence, as always. She didn't sleep that night. The calluses on her palms burned, but there was another flame inside, a strange, wild feeling that she had passed some invisible threshold. And, perhaps for the first time in months, she didn't feel insignificant. When she saw that portrait of a woman and a child again the next morning, her heart sank. Who were they? His wife and son? Are they dead? Gone? The pain was in every inch of this room, in every dust-covered object. But he didn't throw them away. He kept it. As a part of myself. As a punishment. Mabel didn't know who Aiden Kane was. But she was beginning to understand, this is not a story about slavery. This is a story about broken people driven into the wilderness to hide their wounds from the world. And maybe here, on the edge of civilization, something will change between them. It's been a week since she was brought to the mountains. And although the days passed slowly, almost viscous, like molasses in the sun, Mabel no longer counted them on her fingers. Here, among the fir trees and rocks at the foot of the ridge, there were no clocks or calendars, only sunrises and sunsets, the changing weather and the rhythm of the forest's breathing. And yet, something has changed. Unnoticed. Softly. It was as if her heart, which had been silent for a long time, suddenly made its first timid beat. Every morning began the same way. Before dawn, in the silence broken only by the crackling of ashes in the fireplace, she woke up and listened. The wind moaned somewhere far away, and the reflections of snow flickered behind the wall. Sometimes the barn door creaked, opened by a gust. She was still startled by the harsh sounds, still sleeping with her knees pressed to her chest, as in childhood, when her father drank and wandered around the house. But her body was no longer stiff. She didn't feel like a prisoner. More like a temporary guest. On the sixth day, Aiden approached her on the porch as she was cutting dry branches. He had an old rifle in his hand. He didn't say anything. He just held out his weapon and turned around, walking away towards the forest. She froze a little, it was unexpected. But without a word, she followed. He placed the clay pot on an old tree stump. He showed me how to stand up, how to hold my shoulders, how to breathe. She was trembling, from fear, from the cold, from memories. But he didn't rush it. When she fired for the first time, the sound hit my ears, and my shoulder hurt. She flinched, almost dropped the rifle. But he just nodded, again. And again. By the fourth shot, she hit a tree stump. By the fifth, into the pot. Mabel laughed. It came out by itself, a sincere, ringing, slightly frightened laugh. And then, for the first time, she saw Aiden's lips twitch. Not in a grin. Not in mockery. And in the quiet, almost human warmth. A moment later, the stone face returned. But that moment stayed with her all day. She began to change. Not fast. Carefully. She didn't shy away from corners anymore. She didn't shy away from the sound of the knife hitting the board. I didn't hide behind the door when I heard footsteps. In the morning I went to the stream for water myself. She was chopping logs. She knew where everything was in the house. And, for the first time in many years, she did it not out of fear, but of her own volition. Something new began to sprout inside her. Something like self-respect. She noticed how Aiden tended to his knife, how carefully he folded each rope, each jar, how he talked to the dogs not with his voice, but with a movement of his hand. He was a part of this wild land, and suddenly she wanted to be a part of it. At least some kind. One day she saw a fox cub by the forest path. He came cautiously, smelling the food. From that day on, she left him pieces of bread. Sometimes he came back. She sat on the porch, watching him carefully pull the crumbs out of his mouth. And I thought, if this animal isn't afraid, maybe I can stop being afraid. She started visiting the old widow at the foot of the slope. She lived alone, with a silent chicken and a stone face. Mabel brought her leftovers, dried berries, and sometimes just silence. Not words. Not sympathy. Just a presence. Aiden saw it. In the evening, after one such visit, she returned and saw that he had cleaned her boots. Not as a sign of submission. In recognition. But the nights remained hard. In the dark, the memories of his family were especially poignant. Her dreams brought her back to the room with the lopsided lamp, to the kitchen, where her father was screaming, her mother was silent, and the food always smelled of menace. She woke up sweating, her heart pounding. And then, one day, Aiden just came up, not looking into her eyes, and put a second blanket on her shoulders. It was thick, old, and smelled of wood, iron, and male life. He didn't stay long. Gone. But this gesture, short and silent, did what years of prayer, beatings and punishments could not do. It warmed her soul. He didn't hug me. But he admitted it. That night, Mabel lay for a long time, staring at the wooden ceiling. For the first time in her life, she wanted to stay. On one of those infinitely long and cold nights when the mountains around seemed to be covered with silence, Mabel accidentally discovered an old newspaper hidden under the floorboards. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as if the very history it held wanted to melt and disappear with time. But the portrait on the first page was strikingly vivid, the stern, strong face of a man with a thick dark beard and eyes that showed steely determination and deep sadness. Under the photo, the inscription stood out loudly, "Wanted." The reward is $500. Mabel's heart began to beat faster. This man was not just her silent and stern master, he was someone more, someone from the past who now seemed to be covered in shadow. Mabel's thoughts raced all night, and the ice in her soul began to melt from tension and misunderstanding. Who is this person on paper? Why is he being hunted? What secrets is he hiding? These questions seemed to pulse in the air, as if the mountain night itself was waiting to open its gloomy pages. When the sun barely began to break through the coniferous branches the next morning, Aiden spoke. His voice, usually deep and stern, now sounded with rare gentleness. He told, without hiding the pain, a story that explained everything. Before he was a sheriff, a man of law and order. His life was simple and honest, filled with caring for his family. But one day darkness broke into his world. Bandits brutally killed his wife and young son, leaving a void in his soul and a burn that would not heal. Anger and bitterness haunted him. He took up arms not as a sheriff, but as a man deprived of everything he loved. He took revenge with rage and desperation, surpassing those who had ruined his life. But the price for revenge turned out to be terrible. Now he's an outlaw, a fugitive with a bounty on his head, a man no one else saw as a hero. Mabel listened to every word, her heart constricted and expanded at the same time. She understood that behind Aiden's rough, almost bestial appearance, there was a wounded warrior who, like her, carried a heavy burden of loneliness and pain. At that moment, for the first time, they looked into each other's eyes, not as a master and a slave, not as a giant and a fat girl, but as two people who have lost everything, but are trying to find light in the abyss. Aiden looked at Mabel with a deep seriousness and tenderness that he rarely allowed himself to show. His words were like a warm touch to her broken heart. You think you're broken. But you're stronger than you know. It was a recognition and a promise that even in the most terrible trials there is strength and light that will help us move on. That night, when the shadows fell longer and the wind whispered through the trees, they felt for the first time that they were not alone. The past has not remained a dead weight, but has become a whisper, a quiet reminder that each of them has the strength to fight and survive. Time passed slowly in the mountains, but for Mabel, every new day brought changes, subtle but important. She began to pay attention to the kitchen, for the first time in a long time cooking not just food, but real dishes, fragrant, full of flavor, reminiscent of distant holidays and happiness that she had once only seen in dreams. Her hands, accustomed to fatigue and hard work, became more confident every day, and the fire in the stove gave warmth not only to the house, but also to the soul. At the same time, she started restoring the garden around the house. The earth came alive under her fingers, the flower beds bloomed with flowers, and greenery gradually filled the empty spaces, as if nature itself supported her inner changes. Each sprout was like a small victory, as a sign that life, despite all the trials, continued. Aiden, in turn, did not stay away. He decided to build a bench by the river for her, a place where they could sit next to each other, listen to the murmur of the water and look at the stars, which seemed especially close in these wild places. His large, rough hands skillfully worked with wood, and his gaze was filled with quiet care and respect. It was a gesture that spoke louder than words, a sign of recognition in an attempt to create something that could become an island of peace in their difficult lives. Nights were spent around the campfire or at the window with books in their hands. Aiden read aloud to Mabel, and her world expanded with every word, stories about adventures, about people who didn't give up, about dreams that became reality. These stories ignited a spark in her that her soul had been trying to hide for a long time. She began to change, not because of Aiden, but for her own sake. A subtle confidence appeared in his gait, a slight blush appeared on his cheeks. The shadows of previous fears and doubts gradually receded, giving way to light. Every day she became closer to the girl who dreamed of living differently, dreamed of loving and being loved. Over time, the changes in Mabel became noticeable not only to Aiden, but also to others. Her movements became more confident, her back straightened, and her gait became light. She used to hide in her clothes, trying to disappear into her own shadow, but now she has sewn herself a new dress made of blue linen, simple, but emphasizing her figure not with reproach, but with respect. Her cheeks were flushed, not from shame, but from the morning wind and from the inner warmth that burned in her chest for the first time in many years. She no longer lowered her gaze in front of others and did not hide behind her hair. It was this blush and this new light in her eyes that stirred up the silence of the village. The people she had passed by earlier as an inconspicuous shadow were now turning around to take another look. One of the neighbors saw Aiden holding the door of the cart in front of her. Someone heard him laughing, as loudly as no one had heard for a long time. And someone was just jealous of the strange, unexpected harmony that arose in the wilderness, in the house of a mountain man and his strange maid. At first, they whispered at the well. Then, in the store. Then, everywhere. The women were whispering behind their backs, they say he fell in love with her. The men grinned, of course. Who would have thought, such a giant, and a girl? Someone spoke with contempt, someone with curiosity, and someone with the hope that even if she had changed, then maybe all was not lost for them yet. But in the heart of this story, in a quiet house by the river, among the blue shadows of pine trees and birdsong, gossip didn't matter. Because there, among the mountains, one girl with a wounded heart was becoming strong. And one man, who believed that he was forever lost to love, learned to look at the world with a gentle gaze again. It had only been a few weeks since Aiden had first built a bench by the river for her. Then it seemed that peace, though fragile, began to take root in this secluded corner of the mountains. But peace in these places is a deceptive thing, and the forest too often keeps echoes of old footsteps. The air was especially quiet in the morning. Too quiet. No birds, no breeze. Mabel sensed something was wrong before she heard the sounds. My heart began to pound in my chest as I heard the clang of metal and the trampling of horses down the slope. She went out onto the porch and froze. A group was approaching the house along a narrow path. At the head is the one she hoped to never see again. Father. His face has hardly changed, the same stern look, the same hard jaw. But now he wasn't alone. Behind him are three unfamiliar men with rifles and dusty raincoats. One of them had an old, wrinkled newspaper in his hands. On the front page is a faded but recognizable portrait of Aiden and the inscription, "Wanted. $500. Alive or dead." Mabel shrank back. Her palms turned cold. Her father looked at her as if she was not a person, but something spoiled, forgotten, something that could be taken back and used again. Aiden stepped out of the shadows. He didn't ask who they were. He knew. He stood between them and Mabel like a wall, like a tree growing on the border. The father spoke confidently, coldly. He said he wanted to pick up his daughter. He said she was his property. That now that Aiden was a criminal, he had no right to her or to life. He added that he had already arranged for it to be used to get gold coins from a passing dealer in Albuquerque. He talked about it like it was a cattle deal. And at that moment, something broke in Mabel. Or, on the contrary, it came together. Aiden didn't respond with words. He just nodded. Gradually. And then steel flashed in the air, a shot broke the silence. The bounty hunters scattered as if on cue. The real hunt had begun, but now the game was armed and experienced. Aiden moved through the forest like a wolf, quietly, precisely, deadly. One of the hunters fell with a bullet in his thigh. The other one has a broken head. But the third one managed to shoot Aiden. The bullet pierced his shoulder, forcing him to stagger and retreat behind the trees. Mabel stayed at the house. There was a ringing in my ears, and panic in my heart. But there was a rifle nearby. She took it. My hands were shaking. She had never held a gun with the intention of shooting before. But she remembered how he had taught her. As he said, don't be afraid to aim. Don't be afraid to make up your mind. And here he is, the father. Standing right in front of her. Dirty, breathing heavily, but still with the same look, domineering, humiliating, familiar to the point of pain. He held out his hand to her, just like in the old days, when he punished her without words. But she didn't back down. The rifle was now pointed directly at his chest. She looked into his eyes. And, for the first time in her life, she didn't sound like a child. You don't control me anymore. He recoiled. Surprised. What he saw in front of him was not the girl he had left in tears. And a woman, strong, determined. He realized that he had lost power. He didn't argue. He just turned around and went into the woods. Mabel rushed to Aiden. He was leaning against a tree, bleeding from a wound. She knelt down next to him, pressed her palm to his shoulder, stopped the blood, without crying, without getting lost. He looked up with difficulty, saw her, and there was something new in his eyes. Pride. Calmness. They did not sleep that night. They were just sitting around the campfire. Silently. Through the crackle of the flames, through the pain and fatigue, they both understood that everything had changed now. He was protecting her. She's his. And there was no more fear. There was only a house that they built not out of wood, but out of reciprocity. After that difficult duel, Aiden was seriously injured. His breathing was ragged, and the pain wouldn't let up for a minute. Mabel, despite her own fatigue and fear, was there for him, caring for him carefully, with a tenderness and care that had previously seemed inaccessible to her. She carefully washed the wound with cold water from a mountain stream, bandaged it with cloths made from old rags, and did not leave, watching his every breath. In her arms was not just a wounded man, but someone who became her meaning, her protection and support. Days passed, and the wound gradually healed. In the silence of this mountain solitude, an invisible but strong bond was forming between them, no longer a slave and a master, but two people whose souls had found each other. Aiden saw in Mabel not a burden or a punishment, but his soul, the one that was worth fighting and living for. Despite her weight, he lifted her in his arms with amazing ease and trepidation at the same time. These moments were filled with deep meaning. He carried her not as a duty, not out of obligation, but because he sincerely wanted to. Every night he put her in the house, carefully and tenderly, as if he was storing the most valuable thing he had. This act spoke louder than any words. I care about you not because you have to be, but because I want to be there for you. The house, standing on the edge of the wilderness, turned into a new land for them, a place where the past, full of pain and betrayal, ceased to matter. Here, amidst the silence of the mountains and the sounds of nature, a new life was born, filled with hope, love and mutual respect. The sky above the wild mountains of Texas was slowly changing colors, turning from bright orange to soft purple and deep blue, as if nature was painting them a parting chord of the passing day. There was hope hidden in this majestic sunset, the hope of a new life that beckoned forward, despite all the hardships of the past. Mabel and Aiden stood at the edge of the canyon, their gazes fixed into the distance, where only the stars witnessed their decision. The deep silence was broken only by the rustle of dry leaves and the barely audible echo of the wind playing with her light dress. This dress, simple but neatly sewn, seemed to symbolize her inner changes, from a shy and depressed girl to a woman ready to fight for freedom and happiness. Aiden, tall and powerful, was the epitome of strength and protection. His roughened hands carried care and tenderness, and his gaze was full of determination and quiet confidence. The rifle on his back was a reminder of the terrible trials of the past, but now it has become not only a weapon, but a symbol of protecting their new path. He walked beside her, as if promising that no danger would separate them. Their path led through winding trails and narrow canyons, where the rock walls seemed to witness ancient legends and mysterious whispers of the wind. With every step they took, they were moving away from the past, from the pain and betrayal that had nearly destroyed their lives. Now there was only the future ahead, unknown, but filled with light and possibilities. At that moment, time seemed to have stopped. Their shadows, stretched by the last rays of the sun, intertwined on the rocky ground. It wasn't just an escape, it was a new step, a new breath, a new hope. There was a quiet fire in their eyes, a fire that had been ignited inside after months of trials and pain. The voice, over, penetrating and full of meaning, seemed to appeal to everyone who was ready to listen. Sometimes losing everything is not the end, but the beginning. Loss brings freedom and strength. And in this freedom, love is born, stronger than all shackles and fears. Mabel and Aiden disappeared into the twilight, leaving behind the shadows of the past and footsteps on the path leading to a new life, a life where their hearts could finally beat in unison. Thank you for being with us and listening to this story until the very end. If you are affected by it, please like it and share your thoughts in the comments. It is important for us to hear your opinion. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about strength and overcoming. See you.